I'm Coraline Voss, and I've always believed in order. At 49, I'd built a life brick by careful brick, retiring early from civil engineering, investing wisely, maintaining boundaries. My phone buzzed during my morning tea, shattering that order. "Call now," flashed across the screen from my solicitor, Marcus Webb. My hand trembled as I dialed. His voice was tight, professional, but I heard the warning beneath. "Coraline, your daughter has filed legal papers. We need to talk immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mara. My daughter. The pit in my stomach opened wide and dark. I'd spent decades constructing a life of privacy and structure, documenting every decision, every pound spent and saved. Now someone aimed to dismantle it all, and that someone shared my blood. I set down my teacup with exaggerated care, watching the liquid settle. Outside my window, the garden I'd planned and planted continued its indifferent growth. But inside, everything had shifted. My orderly world suddenly felt like evidence waiting to condemn me. Mara had been my shadow once, trailing after me with curious eyes and endless questions. Now at 30, she was polished and distant, a woman who wore grievance like expensive perfume. I'd funded everything: her university education at Bristol, her first apartment in Manchester, the boutique she'd opened 3 years ago in Bath. I'd believed I was giving her foundation, stability, the things my own mother never provided. But her text from 2 nights before kept replaying in my mind: "We need to talk inheritance." Just 5 words, cold and transactional. No greeting, no warmth, just demand. I'd responded asking when she wanted to meet, but she'd left me on read. Now I understood why. She hadn't wanted conversation, she'd wanted action. The daughter who once glued my work boots back together with stubborn, careful fingers had become someone I barely recognized. Someone who filed legal papers instead of calling her mother. Someone who saw my life's work as something to be divided and claimed rather than preserved and honored. Marcus explained everything in his office, the afternoon light slanting through Venetian blinds. "She's filed for temporary injunctions and demanded an emergency inventory of your assets," he said, sliding papers across his mahogany desk. My fingers went cold as I read. Mara's lawyers had accused me of hiding assets and improper transfers. The language was savage, clinical, designed to paint me as a criminal in my own life. My orderly existence, the spreadsheets, the documented decisions, the careful trusts, suddenly looked suspicious through her legal lens. "They're suggesting you've been moving money to avoid her inheritance," Marcus continued. I felt dizzy. Everything I'd done had been transparent, documented, proper. But Mara's team had twisted it into something dark. They'd requested access to my bank accounts, pension details, property deeds, even my old engineering consultancy records. My life, laid bare for strangers to examine and judge. The walls of Marcus's office seemed to close in. I'd always been meticulous precisely to avoid this kind of chaos, but my own daughter had weaponized my careful nature against me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories flickered like old film reels. Mara at 7, determined and fierce, fixing my boots because she'd seen how worn they were. Mara at 12, organizing my workshop with color-coded labels she'd made herself. She'd loved my systems, my structure, even when her friends found it strange. But she'd also chafed against my boundaries. When I'd refused to let her drop out of university to pursue fashion design full-time, she'd stopped speaking to me for 2 months. When I declined to invest in her first boutique location, too risky, too expensive, she'd called me heartless. I'd eventually helped with a smaller shop, but the damage lingered. Our bond had never been simple. I'd been strict, yes, demanding even. I'd expected excellence because I knew what mediocrity cost. But somewhere along the way, my lessons about responsibility had become, in her eyes, lessons about withholding love. I'd ignored the fissures, believing time would heal what my pragmatism had cracked. I'd been catastrophically wrong. The morning light brought no relief, only Mara's public statement. She'd posted it across social media, a long, wounded narrative titled "When Your Mother Chooses Things Over People." I read it with growing horror. She'd written about feeling invisible, about watching me pour energy into properties and investments while barely attending her school plays. She'd framed my retirement savings as hoarding, my careful planning as paranoia. For 30 years I watched my mother treat family like a business transaction, she'd written. The post spread like wildfire through our small network of family friends. My phone exploded with calls, some offering condolences, others probing for gossip, a few demanding I respond. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, watching strangers dissect my parenting in comment sections. People who'd never met me declared me selfish, cold, typical of my generation. Others defended me, which somehow felt worse. The world was shaping itself against me in real time, and I had no defense that wouldn't sound offensive. Mara had turned our private pain into public theater, and I was cast as the villain. The calls kept coming. Old colleagues, distant relatives, neighbors I barely knew, everyone wanted details, wanted to offer advice, wanted to be part of the drama. My sister Junior called 3 times before I answered. "Cora, what's happening?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. I couldn't find words that made sense. Mara's lawyers had sent new demands, immediate accounting of all trusts, detailed pension breakdowns, documentation for the Cape Cod cottage I'd bought after my divorce from Cass 15 years ago. The cottage, my sanctuary, my reward for surviving a brutal separation, was now evidence of something sinister. I pulled out files, cross-referenced bank statements, prepared documentation. Every carefully maintained record now felt like ammunition in the wrong hands. The phone rang again. My bank. "Ms. Voss, we've received a court notice. We need to place a temporary hold on certain accounts pending judicial review." The words crashed over me. My accounts, small, earned, prudently invested over decades, were suddenly inaccessible. The panic was precise, invasive, a cold hand squeezing my chest. Mara's lawyers had accomplished their goal. They'd made me feel like a criminal in my own life. I'd never felt truly powerless before. Even during my divorce, even when starting my consultancy with nothing but expertise and determination, I'd maintained control. But this was different. My own daughter had found the exact pressure points to immobilize me. The account freeze meant I couldn't access funds for legal fees beyond my initial retainer with Marcus. It meant my automatic payments, mortgage, utilities, charitable donations, might bounce. It meant uncertainty, chaos, the exact opposite of everything I'd spent my life building. I sat in my study, surrounded by the order I'd created, and felt it all becoming evidence against me. The organized files, the detailed spreadsheets, the careful documentation. Mara's team would present it as obsessive, controlling, secretive. My strengths reframed as pathologies. I thought about calling Mara directly, but what would I say? Her move had been calculated, strategic, backed by lawyers who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. She wasn't acting on impulse. She'd planned this campaign. The daughter I'd raised to be independent and strong had turned those qualities into weapons aimed directly at my heart. I decided to try anyway. I texted Mara, "Please come to tea. We need to talk, just us." She agreed, surprisingly, and arrived the next afternoon dressed for battle-sharp blazer, perfect makeup, the armor of someone expecting combat. We sat in my conservatory, the space I designed for peace, and she waited for me to speak first. "Mara, I don't understand what's happening," I started. She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Of course you don't. You never did." Her voice was cold, controlled. "You always said legacy matters, Mother. You lectured me about building something lasting, about responsibility, about planning for the future. Now I'm doing exactly that. I want what you won't give." Her eyes were flinty with strategy, not grief. There was no daughter there, no trace of the girl who'd loved me, just calculation. "I've given you everything," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "Everything." She leaned forward. "You gave me conditions. You gave me lectures. You gave me exactly enough to keep me dependent but never enough to be free." The words struck like physical blows. I'd thought I was teaching her self-reliance. She'd experienced it as control. Marcus called 2 days later with news that made my blood freeze. "We've learned something. Mara's been meeting with Gregory Sims." The name registered immediately. Sims was a venture capitalist who'd been sniffing around my former engineering consultancy for years. I'd refused to sell, choosing instead to transition it to my longtime partner when I retired. She's apparently promised him access to your client lists and contracts if he backs her legal fight financially, Marcus continued. I felt faint with betrayal. Those client lists represented 30 years of relationships, trust built project by project. Contracts I'd negotiated, maintained, honored. And Mara was treating them like currency, bargaining chips in her campaign against me. She didn't just want my assets, she wanted to dismantle everything I'd built, to prove she could succeed where I had by taking what I'd refused to give her. The boutique, I suddenly realized, must be failing. She'd mentioned cash flow problems last year, but I'd advised fiscal restraint instead of additional loans. She'd taken my practical advice as abandonment. Now she'd found someone who'd fund her revenge if she delivered my legacy as payment. Junior arrived uninvited on Sunday morning, bringing sandwiches and her particular brand of gentle interrogation. My sister had always been the mediator, the peacemaker, wearing patience like a comfortable shawl. She settled at my kitchen table and asked the question I'd been avoiding. Have you ever actually talked to Mara about succession? About what happens to everything when you're gone? I confessed my fear, the thing I'd never admitted aloud. I'm terrified of disappearing, Junior. Of being reduced to assets and rumors. Of having everything I built torn apart and sold off the moment I'm too old to stop it. She nodded slowly. So you tried to control it all instead of trusting anyone with it. The words stung because they were true. But Cora, by refusing to have that conversation, by keeping everything locked down so tight, you made Mara feel like an outsider to her own family legacy. I wanted to argue, but couldn't. I'd been so focused on preservation that I'd never considered inclusion. She needed to know she mattered beyond being your heir, Junior said softly. She needed to be part of the planning, not just the recipient. It was too late now for those conversations. Mara had moved past talking straight to taking. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but every seat filled with Mara's evidence of my supposed betrayal. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Hale, presented emails showing how I'd restructured a family trust 5 years ago. I'd moved assets into a beneficiary structure that favored my nephew, Daniel Jr.'s son, who was studying medicine and had no inheritance of his own. I'd done it to create balance, to support the family member who needed it most. But Hale framed it as deliberate exclusion of my own daughter. Ms. Voss systematically diverted family resources away from her only child, Hale argued, her voice ringing with practiced indignation. She created a pattern of financial punishment disguised as estate planning. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the documents without expression. I sat rigid, feeling exposed. Everything looked different through Hale's presentation. Not generous support of my nephew, but rejection of my daughter. Not careful planning, but calculated cruelty. Mara sat across the room, not looking at me. I wanted to stand up and explain, to tell the judge about Daniel's circumstances, about fairness and balance. But Marcus touched my arm, keeping me silent. This was theater, not truth. That night, searching through old files for documentation Marcus needed, I found something I'd forgotten. A letter from Cass, my ex-wife, written shortly after our divorce was finalized. I'd shoved it into a folder years ago, too raw to process properly. Now I read it with fresh eyes. Coraline, she'd written in her careful script, you treat family like engineering projects, all structure and calculations. But family is a network, not an inventory. It needs flexibility, trust, room for failure. Mara needs to know she belongs, not that she qualifies. I sat with those words for a long time. Cass had been right, though I'd refused to see it then. I'd approached parenting the way I approached everything else, with systems, plans, measurable outcomes. But Mara wasn't a project to be managed. She was a person who needed to feel chosen, not assessed. The guilt rippled through me, sharp and unwelcome. But alongside it came something else, the uncomfortable realization that the younger woman watching me from across that courtroom was still the daughter I'd raised. Determined, strategic, unwilling to back down. I'd taught her to fight. I just never imagined she'd fight me. The story went public in the worst way. A journalist called, claiming to have sources close to the case. By evening, my private life was scattered across news websites and social media. Wealthy retiree accused of cutting daughter from fortune, read one headline. Others were worse. Mara had written an op-ed for a regional paper framing my financial conservatism as emotional cruelty. My mother taught me to value security above love, she'd written. Now I understand why she lives alone in a house full of locked filing cabinets. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Comments poured in, strangers dissecting my choices, my marriage, my parenting. Some called me practical, others called me heartless. I clutched my teacup so hard I thought it might shatter. But underneath the humiliation, something harder was forming. Anger, yes, but also resolve. I would not be bullied into surrender. I had built my life carefully, with intention and integrity. If Mara wanted to paint me as a villain to get what she wanted, I would defend myself with the same meticulous planning I'd used for everything else. I called Marcus and told him to prepare for a fight. Marcus suggested something I'd been reluctant to consider. A private investigator. If there's more going on than family drama, we need to know, he said. I agreed, and within a week, the investigator, a methodical woman named Sarah Chen, delivered her report. Mara had been meeting regularly with a creditor from her boutique for 2 months before filing the legal papers. The shop was failing, badly, over £40,000 in debt, with suppliers threatening legal action. She'd been desperate for capital and had approached me for a loan last autumn. I'd refused, offering instead to help her create a restructuring plan. She'd called me controlling and hung up. Now I understood. Mara hadn't suddenly decided to challenge me out of wounded feelings alone. She'd needed money urgently and saw my assets as the solution. The public narrative of emotional neglect was strategic, designed to gain sympathy and legal leverage. Sarah had also found evidence of Mara's meetings with Gregory Sims, 5 documented encounters, all at expensive restaurants, all before she'd filed her case. The pattern was clear: desperation, opportunity, and a carefully constructed plan to paint herself as victim while securing the assets she needed. I felt sick. My daughter had commodified our relationship to save her failing business. The emergency hearing was brutal. Mara's team presented affidavits from people I barely knew, a former housekeeper claiming I'd been cold toward Mara as a child, a university friend saying Mara had always felt inadequate compared to my success. They painted a picture of systematic emotional abuse, suggesting my asset management was actually coercive control. The judge, Justice Hammond, studied the documents with furrowed concentration. Marcus countered with audited ledgers showing every transaction, every trust modification, every decision documented and transparent. He presented emails demonstrating I'd offered Mara financial advice, support, and measured assistance repeatedly. This is not hidden wealth, Marcus argued. This is responsible estate management by a woman who has every right to plan her own financial future. The legal chess match unfolded over 3 hours. Every move calculated, every piece of evidence dissected. Mara's lawyer tried to portray my careful documentation as obsessive, proof of paranoia and control. Marcus reframed it as prudence, exactly what any responsible person would do. Justice Hammond finally called a recess, saying she needed time to review everything. We filed out in silence, but I saw something in the judge's expression. Skepticism, perhaps, about Mara's narrative. Hope flickered, fragile and dangerous. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited like predators. Mara emerged from a different exit, saw the press, and did something I never expected. She collapsed, or appeared to, caught by her lawyer with perfect timing. My mother has always been cold, she said to the cameras, voice breaking. Even now, fighting her own daughter in court, she shows no emotion. No love. Just calculations. The footage would be everywhere by evening, I knew. Mara playing the wounded daughter, me cast as the Ice Queen too proud to show feeling. I wanted to scream that I felt everything: betrayal, grief, fury, love twisted into something unrecognizable. I wanted to take her home and hold her and demand to know when we'd become strangers. But cameras chewed up the moment, turning genuine pain into theatrical performance. Marcus guided me to his car while I held myself rigid, refusing to give them more ammunition. Later, in his office, we watched the news coverage. Mara's calculated collapse played on repeat, her wounded expression frozen in high definition. "We need to counter this," Marcus said. "But how?" Defending myself would look defensive. Showing emotion would seem manipulated. Mara had trapped me perfectly. Damned if I responded, damned if I stayed silent. So I sat with my lawyer and plotted a calm, methodical counter-strategy, refusing to play her theatrical game. The settlement offer arrived 3 days later. Mara's lawyers proposed I transfer 60% of my liquid assets to her immediately, place all properties in a joint trust she would manage, and provide her with controlling interest in any remaining business connections. In exchange, she would drop the immediate seizure motion and we could work toward family reconciliation. I read it twice, certain I'd misunderstood. But no, Mara wanted control, not resolution. She wanted to manage my life, my assets, my future, essentially making me financially dependent on her goodwill. The cottage in Cape Cod I'd saved for would require her approval to sell or visit. My charitable donations would need her signature. My independence, the thing I'd worked my entire life to maintain, would evaporate. Marcus waited for my response. "No," I said firmly. "This isn't about money. This is about principle. My life's work is not a commodity to be handed over because she's angry." He nodded, unsurprised. Then we prepare for the long fight. I knew what that meant. More legal fees, more public exposure, more damage to what remained of our relationship. But I couldn't surrender to extortion, even from my own daughter. Not from greed, but from the fundamental belief that giving in to bullying only made it worse. I spent the next week reviewing every contract, every trust document, every piece of my financial architecture. My old consultancy agreements contained clauses I'd forgotten, provisions I'd insisted on years ago that had seemed paranoid then but proved prescient now. They explicitly prevented anyone from accessing client information without unanimous partnership consent. Mara couldn't deliver what she'd promised Gregory Sims even if she won. I also restructured the charitable trusts I'd established over the years. They represented thousands of pounds donated to engineering scholarships, women's education programs, and local community initiatives. I made the trustee structure ironclad, transparent, and completely independent of my personal estate. Mara could fight for my assets, but she couldn't touch what I'd given away to help others. It wasn't about spite, it was about ensuring my values outlived any family dispute. When I finished, I had created a system that protected what mattered most while remaining completely legal and documentable. Marcus reviewed everything, impressed despite himself. "This is good, Coraline. This shows intention and integrity." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like control returning. Not over Mara, but over my own legacy. Then Mara's team leaked my private therapy notes. I'd seen a counselor after my divorce, working through guilt about my failed marriage and my relationship with Mara. Those confidential sessions, my raw admissions of inadequacy, my fears of having damaged my daughter through emotional distance, were now filed as court exhibits. The betrayal cut deeper than anything before. Those notes showed me at my most vulnerable, admitting to being a hard parent, pragmatic to the point of coldness sometimes, struggling to express love the way Mara needed. They showed my awareness of my own failures, my attempts to improve, my genuine desire to be better. But in court documents, stripped of context, they read like confessions of abuse. I was distant, I told my therapist. I prioritized work over presence. True statements, but not the whole truth. I'd also been present in the ways I knew how, at every parent-teacher conference, funding every opportunity, supporting her when she struggled. The court ordered mediation, hoping therapy notes suggesting my awareness of problems might push me toward settlement. The press called it catharsis, public accountability. I called it weaponized vulnerability. Mara had taken my attempts at self-improvement and used them as evidence of my failure. The mediation session felt like an ambush. A neutral mediator, Dr. Carla Winston, guided us through structured dialogue. I offered Mara a carefully planned proposal, staged involvement in my charitable foundations, including decision-making authority as she proved responsible. professional counseling funded by me to help us rebuild our relationship, and a modest increase in her eventual inheritance, structured to provide support without enabling poor financial decisions. "You're offering me crumbs," Mara said coldly. "And therapy. Like I'm the problem." She refused everything, instead doubling down. She revealed deeper resentments I hadn't known existed, anger about my remarriage 3 years after the divorce, claiming I'd replaced her family with a new one, fury about old arguments, perceived slights, moments where I'd prioritized work over her childhood needs. Some of it was fair. Much of it was distorted by time and pain. "You were never there," she said, voice shaking. "And when you were judging me, finding me lacking." I wanted to argue, to defend my choices, to explain that work had kept us housed and fed after the divorce. But Dr. Winston guided me toward just listening. Hearing Mara's pain, even as I disagreed with her interpretations, made something crack inside me. Not surrender, but recognition of genuine wounds beneath the strategic legal attack. Sarah Chen uncovered the full truth about Mara's financial situation. The boutique was worse than we'd thought. Not just debt, but poor business decisions stacked on top of each other. Mara had expanded too quickly, taken expensive leases, invested in inventory that wasn't selling. She'd refused to adjust, believing perseverance alone would save her business. When I declined to co-sign a £40,000 loan last year, I'd offered instead to help her create a sustainable business plan. She'd seen it as abandonment, proof I didn't believe in her. I'd meant it as practical support, teaching her to build something lasting rather than throwing good money after bad. But my strictness, rooted in experience and genuine concern, had felt like rejection to her. She'd grown bitter, then desperate, then strategic. The lawsuit wasn't just about inheritance, it was about proving she could succeed despite me, even if that meant succeeding at taking what I had. The narrative she'd constructed wasn't entirely false. I had been strict, demanding, sometimes cold in my pragmatism. But my refusal had not intended harm. It had intended to teach her what I'd learned the hard way, that sustainable success required discipline, not just desire. The tragedy was that she'd never believed I was on her side. Then something unexpected happened. Thomas Hendricks, a former client from my consultancy days, called Marcus's office requesting to testify. He was elderly now, but remembered a project from 20 years ago. His manufacturing company had been facing bankruptcy when I'd taken the contract. Instead of just delivering the engineering work, I'd helped him restructure his entire operation, worked nights and weekends unpaid, and connected him with financial advisors who'd saved his business. "Coraline Voss is the most honorable person I've ever worked with," he told the court at the next hearing. "She could have taken her fee and walked away. Instead, she treated my crisis like it was her own. She acts for long-term stewardship, not short-term gain." His testimony shifted something in the courtroom atmosphere. Suddenly, I wasn't just the defendant in a family drama. I was a person with a professional record that told a different story than Mara's narrative. Other former clients came forward with similar accounts. Letters arrived at Marcus's office describing my integrity, my commitment, my reputation. The public perception began to shift slightly. Maybe I wasn't the villain Mara had painted. Maybe this was more complicated than wounded daughter versus heartless mother. For the first time, I felt something like hope. Justice Hammond called a final conference. Private, no cameras, just lawyers and family. Mara arrived looking exhausted, the Polish cracking. In a small, wood-paneled room, the judge spoke plainly. "I've reviewed everything. This isn't a case about hidden assets or elder abuse. This is a family that needs to talk instead of fight." She looked at Mara. "Your mother has been strict, perhaps too strict at times. But nothing here suggests malice or intent to harm." Then she turned to me. "And you, Ms. Voss, have been so focused on teaching responsibility that you forgot to show your daughter she was valued beyond her compliance with your standards." The truth hit us both. The judge continued, "I'm not going to rule on this today. I'm going to give you one more chance to settle this yourselves, as family." In that quiet room, Mara's composure finally broke. "I was hungry, Mom," she said, voice cracking. "Not for money, for being seen. For mattering to you beyond being your project or your heir." The words cracked something open in my chest. All my careful planning, my systems and structures, had been about showing love the only way I knew how. But Mara had needed different proof. She'd needed presence, not provision. Vulnerability, not advice. I'd failed at that, and my failure had created this war. We negotiated hard compromises over the following weeks. I agreed to increase Mara's inheritance significantly and restructured some investment shares for her to manage responsibly, with professional oversight to prevent financial disaster. She withdrew the immediate seizure motion and the accusations of hidden assets. The settlement read like a truce negotiated between warring nations, detailed, conditional, built on painful honesty rather than trust. I also agreed to fund counseling for both of us, separately and together, because legal settlements couldn't heal what was broken between us. Mara agreed to transparent monthly financial reviews for her business, accepting the help she'd once rejected as controlling. We both left with losses. I paid substantial legal fees and gave up more than I'd planned. She dropped her campaign and had to face her role in our estrangement. But we also left with something akin to relief. The fight was over, even if the healing had barely begun. The day we signed the final papers, Mara and I sat in Marcus's office, not looking at each other. "This doesn't mean everything's fixed," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "But it means we stopped trying to destroy each other." It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but real. 6 months later, Mara invited me to the opening of something she called the Maker's Haven, a community space for young artisans and entrepreneurs she'd funded with part of her settlement. The boutique had closed, but she'd transformed that failure into something with genuine purpose. We walked through together, quiet among the noise of welding torches and sewing machines. Young people building, creating, learning from mistakes in a space that encouraged experimentation. "You taught me about foundations," Mara said, stopping near a window overlooking the workspace. "I was so angry about how you taught it that I forgot the lesson itself. This place, it's built on what you showed me about sustainability and long-term thinking, even if I hated learning it." She squeezed my hand, the first physical contact in months. "Thank you for not letting me win by breaking us completely." I felt tears threatening, something I rarely allowed. "Thank you for fighting hard enough to make me see what I was doing wrong," I said. We weren't fixed. Trust was still fractured, love still complicated by years of hurt. But we were learning, slowly, that justice sometimes looked like repair instead of victory. That legacy wasn't just about assets and inheritance, but about understanding what we'd built and broken together, and choosing to try again.